Okay, let's take a closer look at the nephron, which is the basic functional unit of the kidney. And again, this has been simplified from your book, but I like this nephron picture. I skipped through a few slides before this that was just talking about the different types of nephron. I'm going to focus on the cortical nephron. There are a few differences, but one nephron is good. They all do very similar processes, so let's focus on this one. So the nephron has the renal corpuscle, which is the top kind of, it all looks like a ball of yarn, but it is the top part. It's labeled on that picture. And then the renal tubule, which is the bottom part that kind of looks like it's one long, really tall U shape. That is the tubule. And so the function of the nephron is to convert filtrate to urine by the process of filtration, which is a passive process. So we'll talk about urine production in the nephron. So again, you see the afferent arteriole, which is how the blood is getting to the nephron. We also see the efferent arteriole, which is where the blood is leaving after it has gone through the renal corpuscle. And then you see all of those capillaries kind of net covering that loop of Henle, which is really the renal tubule. And we'll talk about all of those capillaries and their functions. Okay, so if we look at a close-up look of the renal corpuscle, we see the first, kind of looks like a ball, which is the glomerulus. And so the glomerulus is the function or the part of the kidney that is actually filtering the blood. So the blood arrives from the afferent arteriole and leaves from the efferent arteriole and is filtered in the glomerulus. Now the glomerulus is covered by the Bowman's capsule. It just contains that kind of network of capillaries. Now, even though it's a capillary network, we call it the glomerulus. In the glomerulus, the fluid and the dissolved solutes are forced out of the capillaries by the blood pressure. So what fluids and solutes are in the blood are forced out, and they move from the capillaries into the space, the glomerulus, by filtration. And so then this results in a protein-free solution. Then the blood from there, or that filtrate from there, moves into the renal tubule. The renal tubule is 2 inches long, and it has different segments. So 2 convoluted segments, the proximal tubule and the distal tubule. And then in between those two is the loop of Henle. It's a long bend between forming a U-shaped tubule, and that is called the loop of Henle. So filtrate leaves the renal corpuscle or the glomerulus and enters the renal tubule. And at this point, the composition of the filtrate changes as it travels. And as it travels, it becomes what we're going to call tubular fluid instead of filtrate. Because more substances are going to be added, some substances are going to be taken away. So if you look real carefully at this picture, which has got a lot going on, it shows that the filtrate is leaving the glomerulus, shows the production of filtrate there, and then going into the first section of the renal tubule, and it says in the proximal tubule that reabsorption of water and ions and organic nutrients is occurring. So we're going to talk about all of these phases, but you can kind of see here where they're happening. So reabsorption is happening in the proximal tubule, and then the loop of Henle has more reabsorption of water, and then finally in the distal convoluted tubule we see secretion of ions, acids, drugs, toxins. So we're going to kind of go through each of those steps in a little bit more detail. I'm not sure why I feel like this is a little bit out of order. So I'm actually going to jump past to this, and then we're going to go back. So the kidney is functioning doing filtration, which we just talked about, which is happening in the glomerulus, and then reabsorption, which is happening in the tubules. And so reabsorption is ways that reclaiming water and solutes that can go back into the blood. So it's very important that not all of the water in the blood gets filtered out. Your blood needs water, and so reabsorption is happening in the proximal tubule, and in the loop of Henle. And then the last process or the last part of urine formation is secretion. And secretion is where the last section of the renal tubule is able to extract chemicals from the blood and secrete them into that tubular fluid. So this is helpful in the proximal tubule because we can help bring back that acid-base balance and also keeps pulling waste from the blood. So urea, ammonia, and possibly even drugs or other contaminants. So let's go back to that picture because it's actually got a lot of information on it. You have a picture similar to this in your textbook, but I actually think this one's a little bit better. So the proximal tubule is that where that reabsorption of water is occurring. That continues to happen down here in the loop of Henle. And then at that last section of the renal tubule is where the secretion is occurring. So ions, acids, drugs, toxins are all secreted from the blood and put into that tubular fluid. Then at that point, the fluid collects into a collecting duct, and then we're going to see about where that goes. So once it goes into the collecting duct leaves the cortex. They all join together and leave the cortex. And I'm going backwards, sorry about that. And it goes to the minor calyx and major calyx, which we talked about in the first video. And at that point, the fluid is called urine, and it continues into the renal pelvis. So this is where all of those collecting ducts are going to join together, the minor calyx, major calyx, and then eventually into the renal pelvis. So this talks more about in the I feel like I'm going backwards and forwards, and where am I going? Okay, all right. They're just a little out of order for me, but that's okay. So the corpuscle in the glomerulus is what is filtering, and this talks about the prevention of the passage of blood cells and most plasma proteins, but it does allow water, waste, ions, amino acids to go into the filtrate. But that could be a problem, except that the water is going to be reabsorbed. So we don't have to worry about losing too much fluid because that 99% of that fluid that is filtered in the first step is going to be reabsorbed in those tubules. So here, I think this is similar to the previous picture, but I like the other one better. This just talks about filtration, reabsorption, and secretion. Again, just with some more pictures of the actual water molecules and where they are going. But again, I feel like we've kind of talked about that. I'm not really sure why there's a filtration slide and then not the other two, but filtration is the most important process of the kidneys to filter the blood. But without that reabsorption, we would be in a big problem if we weren't able to reabsorb or reclaim 99% of that water. So as we said in the first video, the kidney is what is actually filtering and making the urine, but after that, the urine needs to be stored and transported and then finally eliminated. So the filtrate is modified and then eventually combined with all of the filtrate from all of the other nephrons and into those collecting ducts and into those calyx, and eventually goes out of the kidney. It ends when the fluid enters the renal pelvis. So at that point, when it's entering the renal pelvis, it is not modified anymore. It is urine. And so the remainder of the urinary tract is responsible for the transport, storage, and elimination of urine. So the ureters, the bladder, and the urethra. So the ureters are a pair of muscular tubes. They connect the kidneys to the urinary bladder and conduct urine through there. They are approximately 30 centimeters long. Again, they're going to look pretty much the same, male and female, because they're coming out of the kidneys. But the bladder is going to look a little bit different, and then, of course, the urethra is going to look a little bit different when we look at male versus female. The bladder is where the urine is stored. It has a triangular area inside the bladder that is bounded by the ureteral openings and then the urethral entrance. So the ureters kind of enter in the top of the bladder, and then the urethra is exiting out of the bottom. Looking at the urethral entrance, it's at the apex of the triangle, the lowest point of the bladder, and that is surrounded by the neck of the urinary bladder. That neck has a urethral sphincter, which is smooth muscle. We've seen these other places. We'll see some more in the digestive system, but sphincter is just a smooth muscle, and it has involuntary control of the discharge of the urine from the bladder. So it's involuntary and is opening and closing based on the urine needing to exit the bladder. The bladder is lined with transitional epithelium all the way back to A and P1 in our tissue types, but transitional epithelium is able to kind of stretch and relax, and so that's why we see it in the lining of the bladder. It is continuous with the renal pelvis and the ureters. It's stratified, and again, it tolerates a lot of stretching. And then there's the middle layer that has smooth muscles, longitudinal smooth muscle, and a circular layer in between the inner and outer layers. The middle layer is the detrusor muscle, and the contraction is what compresses the bladder, and that compression of the bladder is what expels the contents into the urethra. The urethra extends from the neck of the bladder to the exterior of the body. So in females, it's very short, 2.5 to 3 centimeters. And in males, it's much longer because it extends from the neck of the urinary bladder to the tip of the penis, and so that is about 18 to 20 centimeters in length. That urinary bladder, where it sits in males, is a little bit different. It's in between the rectum and the symphysis pubis, whereas in females, it's inferior to the uterus and anterior to the vagina. So the placement is a little bit different, and then of course the length of the urethra is also different.